Hey, today on the Dr. Osborne Zone, we're going to be talking about an amino acid that has the potential to lower blood pressure, to lower triglycerides, to help people with congestive heart failure and muscle problems and weight gain and obesity. This amino acid is key. Very little people talk about it, but we're going to do a deep dive and discuss how much to take, what foods you can eat to get more of it, and so much more. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over into Dr. Osborne's Zone. Hey, welcome back to Dr. Osborne's Zone. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive on taurine. Now, taurine is a unique amino acid for several reasons. Number one, unlike other amino acids, it doesn't form protein. So all the other amino acids that we talk about connect with each other to form longer chains of different proteins that have different functions. But taurine doesn't do that. It stands alone, and we'll talk about some of its functions shortly. It's produced in small amounts by the body, and we'll show you how that's done. It was discovered in 1827 by German scientists. It was discovered originally in ox bile, which is why the name taurine, which comes from Latin tauros, which means bull. So it gets its name from where it was originally discovered in ox bile. Now, it's conditionally essential. The body can produce it in small amounts, but under conditions of high stress or chronic disease and inflammation, and in infants, the body needs more. And so in those cases, it has to come from food. You can't make enough or synthesize enough to get the necessary amounts to sustain healthy function. Okay, let's blow up on the screen here and let's talk about how taurine is produced in the body. So if you look at this diagram here, we've got several different pathways that I want to point out, but one, we can make taurine from the amino acid cysteine. And so what happens is cysteine goes through some different conversions biochemically to form hypotaurine and then subsequently to form taurine here. Now we can also make taurine from the amino acid methionine. So cysteine and methionine are two amino acids we get predominantly from eating animal meats and sulfur-containing foods, both of which make taurine. But you can see here with methionine, in order to properly make taurine, that requires vitamin B12 and folate, which is vitamin B9. So if you're vitamin B12 or folate deficient, maybe you have plenty of methionine, but with these types of deficiencies, you can run into a problem with taurine synthesis. And the same is true when your body is trying to make taurine from cysteine, as you see here, L-cysteine in the center. Well, to get to taurine, which is down here, again, these biochemical pathways are somewhat complex looking, but really what I want you to know is we go from cysteine to taurine, and you'll see in blue, in these small letters here, so that you can see the smaller blue text, that says pyridoxal 5-phosphate. In essence, that is vitamin B6. So in order to make taurine from L-cysteine, you have to have adequate quantities of vitamin B6, and if you don't, you run into a problem. And you can see you can get there several different ways. The body has redundancies built into it, so you can get to taurine going around the block, so to speak. Also, this mechanism requires pyridoxal 5-phosphate, otherwise known as vitamin B6, or you can come just straight down and get to it through that mechanism, also requiring B6. Now, if you go up further, we talked about methionine earlier. This is methionine, S-adenosyl methionine. Methionine has to basically cycle into homocysteine, and you can see for homocysteine to turn into cysteine, that also requires B6, pyridoxal 5-phosphate. All right, so all that confusing chemistry aside, the key takeaway here is Your body requires vitamin B6 to make taurine, and there are multiple different steps where you need B6. And if you don't have it, if your vitamin B6 is too low, you're going to have a hard time making taurine. Now keep that in mind, because as we get into some of the functions and why taurine is important and what it does, it's going to make a lot more sense. So again, you need B6, you need B12, you need folate to produce taurine internally. So if your body is trying to synthesize its own taurine, you got to have those B vitamins in order for that to happen. And if you don't, you're out of business, and then you're going to struggle with a lot of the diseases and other problems that are associated with low levels of taurine. Well, let's look at tissue concentrations in humans. So if you look at this diagram, this shows us where we find taurine in human tissues, the highest quantities. And these quantities are micromoles per gram. But you can see here the retina, which is in the eye, has the largest concentration, at least on the top. Now, there's some newer research showing that the leukocytes, is leukocytes just another way of saying white blood cell, can contain up to, so they're saying 20 to 35 in this diagram, but some saying up to 50. So leukocytes are another key concentrated area where we need taurine, and taurine regulates immune function, and that's why, again, when we see where taurine is stacked, that should give you a good indication of if it's stacked at a high level in that tissue needs more of it. So we see it in thrombocytes, which are platelets. So this would be things like blood clotting. We see a lot of taurine in the spleen. We see it in high concentrations in the heart and in muscle tissue, as well as kidney, lung, brain, liver, and erythrocytes. This would be a red blood cell. So now when we're talking about the fluids of the body, breast milk has a high concentration. That's because the developing fetus, the developing babies, not the fetus, the babies require large amounts of taurine for brain development. We see a lot of it in bile. As a matter of fact, taurine is responsible for producing bile. That's why there's so much taurine in bile. We see some in the plasma and serum. We see smaller amounts in the saliva and cerebrospinal fluid, and then minute amounts in the sweat directly. So that's where we find taurine in the body. So let's take that into account as we explore the key functions or the key roles of taurine. So the first being bile salt formation. Taurine conjugates with bile acids, aiding in fat absorption and digestion. Now, where does this apply? Let's break this down a little bit so that you can understand it. So here we have taurine. This is your liver, because this is where bile is produced. So you've got taurine synthesis occurs in the liver, so from methionine or from cysteine. Remember, I showed you another diagram a moment ago. So these two key amino acids are necessary, and we have these metabolic pathways that require B vitamins, predominantly B6, 12, and folate, which is B9, to get to taurine. Now, once we get to taurine, we can talk about the liver now taking that taurine, right here, taurine, and helping to make bile acids, which are what these two compounds right here are. So these two are just fancy ways, fancy biochemical terms, but these are both bile acids. So we need that taurine to get to bile acids. Why do we need bile acids? Simply put, bile acids help humans absorb fat. So fat absorption is the key role. If you don't have adequate bile production, you become fat malabsorbed. That means you can be depleted in vitamins A, vitamins D, vitamins E, and vitamin K. You could also become depleted in omega-3, omega-6, and other fats. And so where does this apply? To many of you, this applies if you've had your gallbladder removed, right? So sitting on the back of the liver is the sac, the muscular sac called the gallbladder. The gallbladder secretes, you see the gallbladder right here. It's this green sac, and it secretes bile into the small intestine, where it then emulsifies fat. So what does emulsification mean? If you've ever used soap, if your hands were ever greasy and you tried to wash them in water and the grease just wouldn't come off, and then you used a soap, and then the soap turns that grease on your hands into something that's water soluble, that's a form of emulsification. So think of fats as something that need to be turned into water, right? Fat-soluble vitamins and nutrients have to be turned into water-soluble nutrients so that they can be properly absorbed through your small intestine into your bloodstream. So if you don't have adequate bile, your ability to absorb those fats is going to be rendered less, right? You're going to potentially run into fat malabsorption, and that's, again, what leads to this problem. So we need taurine to make this soap, if you will, that helps us to absorb fat. And if you've had your gallbladder removed, this is why so many people with gallbladder surgery take bile salts. Bile salts orally, right? Because when you don't have a gallbladder, your ability to absorb fat becomes less efficient. Now, bile salts are supplements that can kind of overcome this. I produce something called Lipogest that we use all the time in our clinic for people that have had their gallbladders removed. So where might also this be important is those of you with a history of gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, because one of the hallmarks of celiac disease is fat malabsorption. And so what we commonly see in patients with celiac, because they have intestinal damage, they start malabsorbing nutrients. And this could also include malabsorbing vitamin B6 that's necessary to make the taurine, to make your bile acids, and other B vitamins as well. So we see celiac disease, the damage to the intestine can cause fat malabsorption, but so too can the vitamin deficiencies caused by the damage to the intestine can lead to that as well. So this is very common. Now, the other connection here is that many people with celiac disease develop something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFL. There's also autoimmune hepatitis, which is linked to celiac disease as well. So a lot of these individuals that do have reactions to gluten have liver damage, and that liver damage can contribute to an inability to properly not only form bile, but also other problems associated with that liver damage. So bottom line, if you are gluten sensitive and you have struggled with gallbladder problems or liver problems, if you have lower right, kind of right here, this pain that comes across the intestinal over the liver area, and if you have right shoulder blade pain in the back, you may have, that's kind of a physical symptom of gallbladder or of liver dysfunction. It's never a bad idea if you're struggling with that, especially if you've got that history of gluten sensitivity, to get an ultrasound of your liver and gallbladder to get it checked out. Now, sometimes what happens is people will have sludge. Their doctor will say, oh, it looks like you have sludge in your gallbladder. Or, or stones. So you can form gallstones. One of the causes of this sludge formation, of this gallstone formation, is taurine deficiency. So a lot of times what we'll see, people will have a follow-up with their GI doctor. Their GI doctor sends them to the surgeon. They want to have their gallbladder removed. What we encourage these people to do first is to consider taurine supplementation because it can definitely support healthy production of bile. We also encourage them to use vitamin C because this helps with it, as well as vitamin B6. In a perfect world, you would do nutritional testing, so you get testing done to measure deficiencies of these nutrients and then supplement accordingly before you just let a surgeon tear out your gallbladder and now you don't have one for the rest of your life. Now, I know that they try to tell you you have no real need for a gallbladder. You can live and survive without a gallbladder. Certainly you can. We know humans do survive without their gallbladder. However, it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving, and it's about being functionally, effectively healthy, right? So keep your organs. If you've been told this, consider vitamin B6, consider vitamin C, consider taurine as a potential to helping you out. And also definitely consider a gluten-free, grain-free diet. See this happen a lot. We have saved a lot of gallbladders over the last several decades in practice just by changing people's diets. So back to this diagram, a couple of other things I want to point out here. You'll see up here cholesterol. Cholesterol is the primary ingredient that helps you make bile acids. So you start with cholesterol, and then you have this gene called CYP7A1. This is a gene that upregulates the conversion of cholesterol into 7-alpha hydroxycholesterol, which then subsequently leads to bile formation. Now this pathway right here, you'll notice I've got this arrow coming in. Vitamin A and vitamin D regulate the functionality of that enzyme in the conversion of cholesterol into bile, and through a feedback mechanism. So vitamin A and vitamin D deficiency problems can actually increase the messaging that your liver needs to make more bile acids. Why? Because you need bile acids to absorb vitamin A and vitamin D. And that's what we think scientifically, is that when your vitamin A and vitamin D are low, your body tries to make more bile acids to help you to absorb. But if you don't have adequate taurine, and if you don't have adequate vitamin C or vitamin B6, it's going to be really hard to do. So there's multiple nutrients revolved around how your body produces bile acids, but because we're talking about taurine here today, taurine being one of the primary ingredients, cholesterol, those of you that have doctors that want to lower your cholesterol to below 100, bad idea for digestion. You need cholesterol to make bile acids. So food for thought here. Definite food for thought. Don't just throw your functionality away over one opinion. It's always a good idea if you're facing a surgery to get a second opinion. So we just talked about bile salt formation as one of the primary roles of taurine. We've got other roles as well. Calcium regulatory role. So taurine helps calcium and other electrolytes, not just calcium, and basically go in and out of cells. Because when you have too much calcium flooding into cells, you can get side effects, and those side effects can be linked to a number of health conditions. So calcium regulation plays a major role in cardiovascular health and the functionality of how your heart beats. This is why some people with taurine deficiency will actually develop congestive heart failure, CHF. As a matter of fact, in Japan, taurine is approved medically to treat congestive heart failure because it's so effective. So if you've been diagnosed with congestive heart failure, your doctor's got you on multiple diuretics, possibly blood pressure, other blood pressure medications, talk to them about taurine. Talk to them about the Japan research, and do your own pull up some stuff. You type this in, you may be able to pull up some good data for him to look at and maybe help take you in that direction. We also see, though, with this, calcium regulation plays a role in muscle function and development. So we'll see people with taurine deficiencies develop cramps in their muscles, just like you can develop cramping in your heart muscle. You can develop cramps in your skeletal muscles that can, over time, that can lead to dysregulation and lead to atrophy. This is especially true of muscles of slow twitch, muscle fibers that are responsible for posture. So taurine boosts muscle contractility and reduces fatigue, enhancing exercise performance. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the studies that show this as well. We know that taurine is an antioxidant. It neutralizes what are called ROS, that stands for reactive oxygen species, protecting cells from oxidative stress and reducing lipid peroxidation. So the breakdown, basically free radicals, if we want to simplify it, taurine neutralizes free radicals, helping keep your cell's integrity and preserve your cellular function. We know taurine plays a role in nerve function. It acts as a neuromodulator, supporting neurotransmitter release, and may have calming and anti-seizure effects. I'm going to draw something out for you. Let's move this out of the way. So if you ever took a biology class or physiology class in high school or even college, this is my horrible rendition of a nerve. So this is a nerve axon, and this is the bulb, or this what's called the synaptic bulb or cleft of the nerve. And so what happens is you get an electrical gradient comes down this nerve, and on the tip of your nerves you have calcium channels. You've ever heard that term, calcium channel blocker? This is a common medication that doctors use. But every nerve, at the tip of every nerve, and this bulb is what the end of nerves look like, has a calcium channel. And so what happens is when that nerve depolarizes, calcium floods into the nerve. And as that calcium floods into the nerve, stored in the end of the nerves, you have these little bubbles or vesicles that are full of chemicals, depending on the location of the nerve. But sometimes these chemicals are GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. Sometimes they're acetylcholine. Sometimes it's dopamine and serotonin. So you probably recognize, if you don't recognize all of these names, you probably recognize several of them. So what I'm trying to get at here is taurine regulates calcium channel influx so that these nerve chemicals can exit. And so on the other side, this is called the cleft. So this is the space in between typically two nerves. So now imagine another nerve is here, and that nerve goes on down the line. And so you have little receptors on this side of that. So as these chemicals are released, all these little chemicals are released, they bind to that receptor, and then they depolarize the next nerve. And this is how nerves communicate. So this nerve communicates to this nerve through calcium flooding in, releasing these chemicals that then activate the next nerve in the chain. And so these are common chemicals that are in the ends of nerves. So if you've ever heard of GABA, GABA relaxes people. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It allows for relaxation and calmness. Acetylcholine runs your parasympathetic nervous system. So what is the parasympathetic nervous system? It's the primary nervous system that regulates digestion and rest and sleep and healing and repair, calmness, if you will, just like GABA. And then we have dopamine, which regulates our reward centers, and serotonin, which regulates our mood and our happiness, among other things. And so we need taurine to regulate that calcium channel. So taurine plays a pretty pivotal role. Now, this same calcium channel, actually, if we were to erase this nerve, we could draw muscle fibers. And so this nerve can send those same chemicals out here, and those chemicals can activate muscle fibers. So that nerve communicating to the muscle, or that nerve communicating to another nerve, that's why you see a lot of these functions here are redundant, right? So muscle function, neurological function, cardiovascular function, they're all somewhat redundant functions based on taurine's ability to regulate calcium influx and efflux in cells. And we also have vision and retinal health. Remember I showed you concentrations of taurine in different tissues, and the retina was number one. So high retinal taurine levels indicate its importance in eye health, with deficiencies risking degeneration. Definitely in animal models, what we see are macular degeneration and retinopathy, especially when blood sugar is at play. Taurine has a protective effect against high blood sugar and diabetic retinopathies in animal studies. So very, very important in overall eye health. So moving on. So these are some of the, again, main functions of taurine. So let's talk then, based on those things, who's going to benefit? Well, we know that taurine supplementation can reduce weight, so people with obesity. We know that diabetics, taurine supplementation can reduce blood sugar, can reduce hemoglobin A1C. We know the elderly, especially the elderly with sarcopenia, meaning age-related muscle loss. And we know epileptics. as I just showed you, its muscle effects and its neurological effects. So these are just some of the groups of people who can benefit. Let's talk about some of the human research on this. Before we do that, though, I want to kind of give you more of a visual here. So you can see so this is a summary published by Schaefer et al. And Schaefer has done a lot of research on taurine and done a lot of great review papers on it. But this is kind of a summary of this particular paper. You can see taurine's function in the CNS. That's the central nervous system. So, and again, these are in animal studies, but also in cell studies. We have some human studies. I'll show you those as well. But reduction of stroke, reduction of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, Huntington, and Parkinson's. We have epilepsy reduction. We have retinal degeneration is reduced with taurine supplementation. And then from the metabolism and inflammation, we've got diabetes, arthritis, and oxidative stress. In the circulatory or cardiovascular, we've got reduction in heart failure. As I mentioned earlier, Japan uses taurine as a medicine to treat congestive heart failure. We have reductions in high blood pressure, in plaquing or atherosclerosis, and what's known as ischemia reperfusion injuries, which is when somebody has a heart attack and the blood's cut off and then that blood flows back in. It creates a massive amount of damage called ischemia reperfusion. As the blood goes back in, you've got a lot of free radicals that occur. And then myocardial arrhythmias as well. And then in the muscle, you've got muscle contraction, sarcopenia, and Duchenne muscular dystrophy and myotonic dystrophy all benefited as a result of taurine supplementation. Again, in vitro studies as well as animal studies. We'll talk about the human studies. And then you have here emergence of taurine as a therapeutic agent for neurological disorders. This paper kind of did a nice graphic summary. So you can see here in the brain, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, and depression. We have eye disease, retinal degeneration, lung cancer, and cervical cancers, chronic renal disease or renal failure. We have taurine helpful for asthma, and it's protective in the liver, so it's hepatoprotective. We know it affects sarcopenia, so it improves muscle density, and we know that it helps to improve metabolic disease like diabetes. So again, these are summaries of what's been done in the research. Not all human trials. Many of these studies are what are called in vitro cellular studies. Many of these are in animal studies like in mice and others. But I want to show you some of the human research on this so that you do have an idea for what's out there. So this was a study on the effect of taurine supplementation on diabetes in humans. It was a systematic review and meta-analysis of multiple trials. They included in their, they identified 2,200 studies, but only included 5 because they were randomized controlled trials, and so the data was a little bit more clear. But in these 5 randomized controlled trials, which included a total of 209 participants, what they found is that taurine supplementation is beneficial in reducing glycemic indices such as hemoglobin A1C, fasting blood sugar, and HOMA-IR in diabetic patients. So we got reduction of those 3 parameters in humans using taurine supplementally. Now, more human studies here. You see oxidative stress and inflammation and obesity after taurine supplementation. This was a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. And so you can see taurine was given at 3 grams a day in the taurine group, and then there was 3 grams of starch given in the placebo group. But you can see the results. Plasma taurine levels significantly decreased 41% in the obese volunteers. So the obese people had lower taurine levels compared to the non-obese. Both the placebo and taurine groups showed significant reduction in weight, 3% reduction in weight. Taurine supplemented groups showed significant increase in plasma taurine, meaning their taurine levels came back up, and they had an increase in a compound called adiponectin. Now, if you don't know what adiponectin is, it's like a hormone made from your fat. So it's fat cells release adiponectin, and they have adiponectin has an anti-inflammatory effect. So that's why it's a very important molecule. So you can see again, adiponectin increased in people supplementing taurine. And then they also had a significant reduction in the inflammatory marker HSCRP, which is CRP, that's C-reactive protein, 29% reduction. But they also had a reduction in lipid peroxidation marker, thyrobarbituric acid, which is a measure, T-bars for short, is a measure of genetic damage, of DNA damage. So basically, the women who supplemented with taurine lost weight. They had more adiponectin, which is anti-inflammatory. Their C-reactive protein went down, and their T-bar scores also went down. So humans having good benefit. In this case, it was a 3-gram dose of taurine. And that study was 8 weeks long. So you can see it didn't take, a year to get any benefit. It happened within an 8-week time frame. You see this study, taurine reduces the risk for metabolic syndrome. This was a systematic review and analysis of controlled trials as well. So in this one, it was 1,000 participants from 25 randomized controlled trials. What they found was significant reductions in SBP, that stands for systolic blood pressure. That's the top number on the blood pressure. When your doctor takes your blood pressure, you have that top number, that's your systolic. Well, they got 3.9, almost 4. We'll just round it off to 4-point reduction of systolic blood pressure on average. They also found the diastolic blood pressure, so that bottom number dropped by 1.5 points. So you got 1.5 reduction in diastolic. And then moving on, fasting blood glucose, that's what FBG stands for. They got almost a 6-point reduction in fasting glucose. And then the triglycerides dropped about 18, almost 18, well, 18.3 points. So those of you with high triglycerides, I see this all the time. It's a common mistake, but if your triglycerides are high, a lot of times doctors want to put you on statins to lower your cholesterol. Triglycerides and cholesterol don't have anything to do with each other, so a statin won't lower your triglycerides, but doctors still try to put high triglyceride patients on statin drugs anyways. Like I said, I see it all the time, but in this study, they got more than 18-point reduction in triglycerides. If you're looking at your numbers in your triglyceride values, what you're really after is you want, the reference ranges on most lab will say 150 milligrams per deciliter is the value that you're aiming for, but I disagree with that. I like to see 75 milligrams per deciliter or less of when it comes to the triglyceride value. So 18 points is a pretty substantial amount for supplementing with taurine. You can see no significant adverse effects were observed. So in their conclusion, taurine supplementation exhibits positive effects on multiple metabolic syndrome-related factors, making it a potential dietary addition for individuals at risk of or already experiencing metabolic syndrome. So again, human trials, all showing benefit. Now here's some more human studies. This is kind of a conglomeration of several studies, and I've highlighted the ones with positive outcomes just so you can see the potential. And what's interesting is this one here, this IDDM, that's insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. They gave a dose of 1 gram per day for 30 days, and they found that glucose metabolism and triglyceride levels improved. So similar to what we talked about a moment ago. In this study, overweight non-diabetics received 3 grams a day for 2 weeks, and they had improvements in insulin sensitivity. In this study, cholestasis, which is a stasis of your gallbladder, which is, these are patients that were on parenteral nutrition, so they were on a feed bag. They gave approximately 25 milligrams per kilogram per day of taurine. And they did this for 50 days, and they found that it protected the liver and it reduced the liver enzymes, the AST, the ALT, and the GGT, so hepatoprotective. Down here, we've got a study by Azum et al. On congestive heart failure. They gave 6 grams of taurine a day for 4 weeks, and heart parameters improved. And then down here, we've got a couple of different studies, one on epilepsy. They gave 200 milligrams and up to 21 grams, and they saw seizure frequency reduction. And then for dystrophic myotonia, They gave 6 to 10 grams for 6 months and found that myotonic symptoms improved. And then here in the elderly, just a study on elderly folks, 500 milligrams, so a pretty small dose, and it was in part of a multi-nutrient supplement, only for 4 weeks, and they found that the physical function outcomes improved in the elderly. So not bad, considering, taurine doesn't have the funding from Big Pharma to do all this research. You got to understand how much money it costs to do human trials. It's very, very expensive. I mean, a trial will average anywhere from $1 to $2 or more million just for small trials. And so without funding, it's fantastic that we have so much data about this amino acid. And here's another summary of some of the effects of taurine in sports and athletic performance. And so what you see here is this randomized double-blind crossover. There were 21 males. They were given 0.05 grams, so 500 milligrams of taurine before exercise, and taurine supplementation decreased muscle damage, decreased oxidative stress. We also see here in this randomized study, 20 participants, they gave 1 gram 5 times a day of taurine taken before and after activity, before and after the weightlifting, and then the study results observed taurine is effective in reducing neuromuscular skeletal fatigue, choice reaction time, and blood lactate accumulation. And blood lactate is that stuff that's responsible for your muscles burning when you're exercising. So you see here this study on 8 people, 1 gram a day of taurine before exercise significantly enhanced the endurance, running performance, but the mechanism was unclear. So there's some research, some pretty good research on humans benefiting from exercise, both exercise recovery, but also in exercise performance. Okay, let's look at a few other parameters around it. So I've shown you a number of human studies. We got one more here I want to pull up. This was a human study as well, more on the impact of taurine in the ear. So tinnitus, which is a common condition, especially in the elderly. So many of you may suffer with tinnitus or ringing of the ears. And so what they're looking at is taurine as a potential impactor of tinnitus. And so what they found in these subjects was they had downregulated taurine. So they didn't have as much taurine. The people that suffered with tinnitus didn't. And they think this has to do with the calcium regulation in the nerve in the inner ear, in the cochlear mechanism. So there's a cranial nerve called the vestibulocochlear nerve that feeds the organ of your hearing. And just like I showed you earlier, where the nerves have calcium channels in them and that calcium fluxes in so the nerve can communicate, taurine plays a role in regulating that. And so what they think, part of what they think is that the taurine, downregulated taurine, causes perturbations of calcium signaling and GABA signaling, leading to potentially heightened sound patterns and tinnitus. So this was in humans. They found tinnitus patients having lower taurine. Now, we don't have much in humans on taurine and tinnitus, but I wanted to show you some of the studies on animals. So this one was done on the effects of supplemental dietary taurine on tinnitus in an animal model, in this particular case in rats. And what they found, the results are consistent with the hypothesis that taurine attenuates tinnitus and improves auditory discrimination by increasing inhibitory tone and decreasing noise in the auditory pathway. Then we also have this other study on taurine and animals. You see cochlear damage affects neurotransmitter chemistry in the central auditory system because of taurine's association with GABA and glycine neurotransmission. Decreased taurine levels could be associated with decreased inhibitory activity in the central auditory system, i.e. tinnitus, which could result in tinnitus. So previous animal studies have found that a decreased blood taurine concentration is associated with hearing loss and that taurine administration can decrease behavioral evidence of tinnitus. I would simply say this: we don't have any human studies that show for certain that taurine supplementation can reverse tinnitus. But if you have it, it's miserable. It can be a very miserable and in some cases psychologically dangerous condition because it can lead people to want to commit suicide. It can be very, very damaging. So if you haven't considered taurine, you don't really have anything to lose. Taurine isn't dangerous. There's no real tremendous side effect that's ever been reported as a result of using taurine, but you may find it to be helpful or supportive. It's, in my opinion, definitely worth a try if you're really suffering and nothing else is working. So wanted to show you this study as well. This was a really good kind of overview. A lot of the research, as I've mentioned, has been done predominantly on animals, but we do have, as I've shown you, some of the human studies. But what we think about taurine as far as aging is that taurine actually, deficiencies can drive the aging process. And so animal studies show a lot of effects in this. You can see that taurine deficiency or taurine supplementation improves the mouse life, but also improves the life of the worm, the health span. So you can see, and some of the mechanisms are improvement in muscle, improvement in bone, improvement in pancreatic function, improvement in gut function, brain function, immune function, reduction in fat storage, improvements in energy. So all important factors and symptoms associated with improved health. So you can see here taurine's impact on senescence means aging. It means cellular aging, so the cells age, right? Improvements in intercellular communication, so how cells communicate. Telomere shortening, if you don't know what a telomere is, taurine reduces telomere shortening. Telomeres should be long. Telomeres are the end caps of your DNA. So think of that, that end cap on the end of your shoestring that keeps your shoelace from just kind of coming unraveled. That little cap is think of that the way you would think of a telomere. Telomere is like a little cap that covers the end of your DNA, and if the structure's intact and it's long, we see longer longevity. So taurine stops telomeres from becoming too short. We know that taurine played a role in improved nutrient sensing and had epigenetic changes, particularly on muscle. We know that it reduced genetic instability, reduced loss of proteostasis, reduced mitochondrial dysfunction, and reduced stem cell exhaustion. So we know in humans, taurine deficiency is associated with poor health. As I showed you already, the human trials showing improvements in blood pressure, blood sugar, body mass index, improvements in diabetes parameters, reduction in weight, protection of the liver, reduction as BMI, abdominal obesity, and then regulatory effects on inflammation. What we're missing, for the most part, is more data. We need more trials. Like I said earlier, the problem with a lot of these nutrients, and I'm hoping this changes, make America healthy again. I'm hoping this changes, that we're going to start seeing, instead of throwing billions of dollars at drug funding that doesn't do anything to empower a person to get healthy, we'll see some of these billions of dollars being thrown into nutrients. One of the things I think is really important to point out in all of this is the war against protein. Now, if you haven't watched my show on protein deficiency, highly recommend that you go back and watch it. We'll put that link below in the show notes. But there's a war against protein. Now, I've shown you today so far that taurine is a critical amino acid that's required, in the best way we eat taurine in our diet is protein. Now, when I say there's a war on protein, let me be more specific. There's not a war on protein. There's a war on animal protein, which is where you find most of the taurine in the human diet. As a matter of fact, we know people that are on plant-based diets, vegetarian diets, very frequently don't get enough taurine. We see this in the children of vegetarians, that they struggle more, they have more doctor's visits, they have more problems. But this war that's going on against animal protein, right, and it's, generally speaking, it's the mantra is save the planet, don't eat protein, get rid of cow farts, let's make synthetic meat. The way I see all that is, it's really just one man who is greedy as hell and wants to make a lot of money creating synthetic junk food and then feeding that to us, not so that we can be healthier, but so he can make more money. And in the process of him putting out propaganda about the war on protein and save the planet, he's converted an entire generation to feel like they're responsible for the demise of our planet and the global warming or climate change of our planet, when in reality, we need protein. And what we see probably, if I could say what one nutrient deficiency is greater than any other, it would be protein. And I think this is why so many people who go carnivore have such a tremendous turnaround in their health. I mean, they're now studying this at Harvard and other places where carnivore diets are reversing a number of different diseases. But I don't think it's because they're not eating plants. I think it's because they're eating more protein. I think these people that start out, originally they're sick. They've been eating a standard American diet, which is, 70+% carbs and very low protein, and they're protein malnourished. And that low protein is also indicates low taurine. It translates into low taurine. And as I've shown you many of the effects of taurine, look at all those effects that we see: senescence and loss of muscle in the elderly. What happens to the elderly? You live your whole life, being told eat this, not that, from people who aren't nutritional experts, and the news allows it because they don't do their job anymore. And so you got a bunch of experts that are being paid by industry to put out false propaganda information about nutrition. And what you end up with a diseased population with lots of RX meds. And so we look at some of these RX meds directly. For example, statins. One of the top prescribed drug. Statins block cholesterol production. You need cholesterol to make bile acids. You need that to absorb fat. People feel better on a ketogenic diet because they're getting more fat, because they've been treating their illness, which you're not really treating an illness, you're treating a lifestyle. You're treating the wrong lifestyle with prescription drugs that will never get you out of the water. You have to change your diet. So if we look at changing the diet, increase the protein, increase the fat, reduce the medications, other meds like antacids. You need acid to absorb protein, to absorb amino acids. You can't break them down from your food. If you don't have stomach acid, you're not going to absorb or digest taurine very effectively. And of course, there's others. We'll talk more about some other things that can deplete taurine. But my point in saying all this is, we live this lifestyle where we've been misinformed. Now we're unhealthy as hell. We're being overprescribed medications. The medications work against us to ever dig out of the hole, but then we have psychological warfare being played against us, saying that if we eat a certain way that we're somehow destroying the planet. Don't fall prey to all that nonsense. Watch that show again on protein. Now let's talk about causes of taurine deficiency. I mentioned this already. It's just a couple of things here. So plant-based or vegetarian-based diets, more risk for taurine deficiency. There's just not a lot of taurine in animal food or in plant-based foods. Inadequate protein. So you may not be eating a plant-based diet. You may just not be eating enough protein. We see this a lot in the elderly, where they're reducing the quantity of food that they're consuming, it's particular in the protein, and they're doing a lot of snacking and things like that. Or the protein that they're getting in is that Ensure garbage. If you've ever seen, I think there's some lawsuits right now against this company, because basically it's corn syrup with crappy protein byproducts that are highly processed. It's not very good for you, but the elderly, the doctors who know nothing about nutrition are telling the elderly to drink this garbage to get their protein levels up because they're protein malnourished. And so eat real meat, eat real food, and you'll do well to get your protein levels up. It's estimated that the average person that needs 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. And that body weight is not if you're obese. That body weight is your lean body weight, what your body weight should be if you're lean. So 1 gram per pound of lean body weight. We know that taurine deficiency can be caused or contributed to when people are taking antacids. And this could be Tums, this could be Rolaids, this could be Nexium, this could be Zantac, this could be Prilosec, or any of the other medications that are commonly used to fight off heartburn. Heartburn is just a manifestation of eating the wrong diet. So quit treating your heartburn and change your food. Nutritional deficiencies. I showed you earlier that vitamin A and vitamin D play a regulatory role in the production of taurine. Zinc does too, vitamin B6, so does folate and B12. Cysteine and methionine, remember these are the two core amino acids that we can produce, synthesize taurine from internally. I think I showed you that picture earlier, but I think I have another copy of it here. So just to kind of refresh your memory here, here's cysteine. And, you know, we try to make taurine from cysteine. So here's taurine. So we can make from cysteine, we can go this way to get to taurine, and that requires vitamin B6. We can go this way to get there. We can go as well through methionine. So there's another mechanism that's not listed on this chart, but there's a methionine pathway. And we need B12 and folate for that pathway to get to taurine. So these nutrients are necessary to make it. So if you're not eating the meat and you're trying to be on a plant-based diet, you know, what you also have to remember, keep in mind, is that where do we get dietary cysteine and methionine? Predominantly, we get these in animal meats. Where do we get the most vitamin A? In organ meats. Vegetables are not a good source of vitamin A. They're a source of beta-carotene, which can convert to vitamin A, but they're not vitamin A. They're what we call provitamin A. And then zinc you predominantly get from meat, and B6 you predominantly get from meat. So most of the nutrients required to make taurine are derived from animal meats. And so if you're going back to this plant-based diet, I just encourage you, I'm not judging any of you for choosing that diet. I'm just simply saying, ask your doctor to measure your levels and protect yourself. And then we know that chemotherapy drugs can also create deficiency of taurine. And we know that the epileptic drug vigabatrin can cause a taurine deficiency as well. So lots of potentials there for what causes deficiency, and you just want to make sure you're watching out for those things. So how do we know? Let's talk about testing. If you want to get your taurine levels checked, probably one of the easiest ways to have your medical doctor do it, if they'll do it, is a plasma test where you're measuring in the plasma, and this is an adult reference range, so it's 44 plus or minus 9 micromoles per liter. And then, so that's one way to test it. Not my favorite way, but my favorite way to test is right here. It's intracellular, or INA, intracellular nutrition analysis, where you actually take your cells and measure their functionality based on whether or not they have adequate quantities of taurine. So this is how we can ask for testing. If you can get your doctor to run plasma, great. If you can't, you want to do intracellular, you can go online to Gluten Free Society. We'll put a link up for you to check out more on intracellular testing. In addition, you should be eating food sources of taurine. So maybe some of you are more plant-based, but also will eat seafood. Seafood is an excellent source of taurine. Dairy products can be if you're not allergic to dairy. We got red meat, obviously. Red meat, beef, and lamb contain very high amounts. Poultry and turkey and chicken also contain taurine, less than red meat, but still good amounts. And seafood, certain ones, especially shellfish, are really high in taurine. And then, again, dairy products overall, good sources. So if you're considering supplementation, how much should you consider taking? We have seen research studies in humans taking well above this range, well above the 6,000, well over 10,000. But I don't recommend that. I would say this range between 500 and 6,000 is probably a pretty good place to think about it. And a lot of the research shows tremendous benefits, somewhere around the 2 to 3 grams per day range, with some of the things I showed you today. So like the blood pressure and the blood sugar and the weight and the hepatoprotective effects and the exercise recovery. But Again, ultimately, if you're going to go into those higher doses, I always encourage you to work with a doctor or a provider who understands and has an expertise in nutrition. But generally pretty safe here. And taurine as a supplement is available over the counter. It's not a prescription drug. It's very easily to come by. And if you're looking for gluten-free or grain-free source, you can always use Gluten-Free Society as a resource where we have a source of taurine there that you can check out as well. So that's it for taurine. That's our crash course. I hope this information was helpful for you. Look, if you think it'll help someone else, if you know somebody else struggling with some of these taurine deficiency issues, share this video with them. Together we can help more people. And we'll see you next time on the Dr. Osborne Zone. Make sure you subscribe and hit that like button. Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this. And make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes.